you describe it for us? Valerie?
Yeah, this is, it might sound a little silly because it's not a particularly old tree, but as you mentioned earlier, I grew up in Belgium, and my mom still lives in the house where I grew up. And when I grew up, there was a very large larch tree, which is still there, and it's still very large, but it was already large when I was a 3-year-old. So I'm very fond of that larch tree.
And they're a beautiful colour too, aren't they? Especially when they get their new leaves.
Exactly. When they get their new leaves, they're very bright green, beautiful color, as you say. And then in the fall, when they lose their needles, they turn beautiful yellowish. So yeah, beautiful colors throughout the year.
Michael, what about you?
This is a very hard question because it's sort of like, asking me to pick my favorite child. Fortunately, I only have one child, so that's easy. But with the trees, one is a chinkapin oak, and this is in the U.S. state of Kentucky. What I love about this tree is that it has this great story of human history, right? And so this tree is about 400 years old, which I've cored and counted rings on this tree. And by its form, it's very straight and tall at first, but then it has all of these horizontal limbs coming off of it. And these date to the early 1800s when this area was settled by Europeans. For the next 100 years, it was basically in a pasture, a cattle pasture, and it lived that way for, about 100 years until the forest came back up around it. This farm was abandoned, and now this tree, this 400-year-old tree, lives surrounded by trees that came up in the early 1900s, so 1910s. And so it's just a really wonderful story that captures many of the elements of American history with regard to the land. The other one that I have to mention is the alerce tree, in this Fitzroya trees in the Patagonia region of Chile and Argentina. They kind of resemble a coastal redwood or a giant sequoia, and that the bark is sort of reddish, really thick, stringy, kind of ropey bark. And you walk in and you sit down in front of one of these trees, and this is the second oldest known tree as a species, 3,600 years old. And just sit there with them and just ponder that lifetime and, all of the sort of human history that's captured in that period. But then just to sit there and imagine that that these trees are sort of contemporary, as Peter was discussing, with some very old aspects of Earth's history, and just to think that a dinosaur or something would pop out from behind this tree, it's just amazing to have a plant crack open your imagination in that way. It's just wonderful.
And Peter, what about you?
Well, I rather like Valerie and also Michael, I've had the great privilege of being able to travel and see some really magnificent trees in the tropics and in the southern hemisphere. The wonderful kauris on the North Island of New Zealand, for example, magnificent trees. But I think I have to come back to that ginkgo tree at Kew. I like to think of it as one of the great celebrity ginkgos of the world. It's been there since the time of George III. It's seen everything that's happened for the last 250 years, the Industrial Revolution, world wars, massive cultural changes, massive changes in technology. But it's been there this whole time. And so, it pays to think about that time period and use it to sometimes reflect that our very short-term view may not be the one that in the end is the most important.
Well, that's a great place to end. Thanks, all three of you. That's all we've got time for today. Peter Crane, Valerie Truet, and Michael Gage. We'll be back next week with another edition of The Forum. I'm Bridget Kendall, and thanks for listening.
And now Sporting Witness with me, Steve Hankey. Today, it's the story of the French men's team winning the European Football Championships in 2000, becoming only the second side to hold both the World Cup and the European Championships at the same time. It's the 2nd of July 2000 in Rotterdam's historic De Kuip Stadium. France are playing Italy in the final of Euro 2000. We're into stoppage time, with Italy 1-0 up, having scored in the 55th minute. But in the very last minute, French goalkeeper Fabien Barthez launches a hopeful ball up the field.
Barthez with a free kick, headed on by Trezeguet, into the penalty area, here's a chance, shot a great goal, into the net! The equaliser, Will Tord,
It's a miracle. Of course, yeah. No, yeah. Of course, it's a miracle, yeah.
Midfielder Robert Pires had been on the pitch for 8 minutes, a late change to help France get an equaliser. So the final was heading to extra time, and France's dream of becoming only the second team to hold both the European Championships and the World Cup at the same time was still somehow alive.
People of France took to the streets last night in the biggest national celebration since the Second World War liberation.
2 years before, as the host nation, France won their first ever World Cup with a team that was lauded for its multicultural makeup.
And in the multiracial squad, many young people from immigrant families have at last found a France with which they can identify.
Euro 2000 was the 11th European Football Championship, and the first to be hosted across 2 countries. With games played in 8 cities across Belgium and the Netherlands, 16 teams qualified for the tournament proper. France were drawn in the tournament's group of death, with fellow favourites the Netherlands, Euro 96 runners-up the Czech Republic, and Euro 92 champions Denmark.
Anelka, Schmeichel comes out, might run for Blanc, and it does!
When you start the competition, the first game, it's the most important.
And the world champions have taken a quarter of an hour to make their mark on Euro 2000.
The 3-0 win over Denmark and the 2-1 victory over the Czech Republic gave France a really strong start.
You won the first game, but you need to try to be continued to win the second game. It's not easy because you are the world champions, so everyone, they want to beat you.
A heavily rotated French side lost their final group game 3-2 against another footballing heavyweight, the Netherlands. Next up was Spain in the quarter-final, and goals from Zinedine Zidane and Yuri Djorkaeff secured a 2-0 victory for the French.
Into the penalty area, great shot, great goal. It was a lightning quick move for the world champions and a fantastic finish by Djorkaeff. It's France 2.
France marched on to the semi-finals, where they'd face Portugal.
What a goal! Nuno Gomes on the turn. The young man who'd never scored for Portugal before this tournament has now scored 4, but that could be the most important one of all. It was a mistake on his 100th appearance.
France were 1-0 down, and for the first time in the tournament, they looked like they were in trouble.
It was a bad moment. Yeah, you need to put a good reaction on the field. So that's why when you have players like Deschamps, Desailly, it's more easier to put your head up.
But the French started the second half strongly and were level within 5 minutes, with Arsenal striker Thierry Henry scoring his 3rd goal of the tournament.
Plays it back to Henry. Henry shot! Scores for France!
The game went to extra time, with both sides having chances to take the lead. With minutes to go before a penalty shootout, David Trezeguet runs into the box, winds up a shot, but the ball is cleared off his feet by Portuguese keeper Vita Baia.
Blocked by Xavier, is it a handball?
After an agonising wait for the French, referee Gunter Benko awards a penalty. At Euro 2000, the golden goal rule applied in extra time, so whoever scored first was through. Zinedine Zidane faced down Vita Baia from the penalty spot.
Nobody knows the pressure on this moment is very intense because it's semi-final. Can you imagine? So that's why the crowd, it was full. If you score, you are the hero. But if you lost, all the country, they kill you.
At that moment, Robert Pires had no doubt France were going through.
When Zizou put the ball, I say, yeah, it's finished for Portugal. Yeah.
Zinedine Zidane, right-footed, high into the net, and France are through to the final on Sunday in Rotterdam.
In the other semi-final, the Netherlands lost a penalty shootout to another aristocrat of the European game, Italy.
The nickname for Italian team is Catenaccio. The base of the team is the defense. When you are on your defense, Pesotto, Maldini, Nesta, Cannavaro, exactly, it's oof.
Italy were famous for their Catenaccio, or chain, tactical system, which relied on taking the lead and then shutting the opposition out completely, with 5 defenders and a defensively solid midfield. And in the final, that's exactly what happened, with Roma's Marco Del Vecchio giving the Italians the lead in the 55th minute.
Pasotto's ball in. Oh, Del Vecchio's there to score for Italy.
When Del Vecchio is scored, not to say it's finished, but almost. It was not a good a game for France. And for France, it was difficult to find a solution. We didn't find a solution.
Pires came on in the 86th minute with France still 1-0 down. But the French manager Roger Le Maire put him on at left back, and not his usual attacking midfield position.
Roger Le Maire, he called me and said, yeah, you will. I want to see you on the left flanks. I say, yes, okay, but I'm not a defender. Well, I'm very bad about this. I have only 4 minutes and maybe... So what can I do?
Did you basically ignore what he said?
A little bit, yes, a little bit.
Italy's Catenaccio held heading into the final minute of the game. Then came the stunning equaliser from Sylvain Wiltord.
Wiltord, in stoppage time, has taken this European Championship final into extra time.
When Sylvain Wiltord scored, we will say it's finished for Italian. Because he was tired, it's normal. Because they fight against Dutch, they fight against France in the final, so they lost a lot energy. When Wiltord scored, we'll say, yes, finished. The title is for France, yeah.
Nearly the whole of extra time had been played with neither side getting the golden goal. But then just 3 minutes before a dreaded penalty shootout, Robert Pires picks the ball up on the left-hand side.
Pires now, dribbling well. Can he cut it back for Trezeguet? In it goes. Trezeguet! Trezeguet with the golden goal for France!
The cross, he was no good, huh? No, believe me, David Trezeguet to score like this, it's an amazing goal, yeah.
France hadn't led in the final until the very last second, but it was the only second that mattered. Behind for 39 minutes, seconds away from losing in normal time, at the end of a gruelling tournament that had seen them beat Spain, Portugal, and now Italy to climb to the top of the tree in Europe.
Where is that Henry Delaunay trophy? It's in Deschamps' hands. He raises it to the skies. Flares go off.
In France, we say it was a good movie. No, seriously. Everything was perfect. One of the best moments during my career, in this moment. It was the double. For us, it was very important to sharing this moment. A trophy was like a bridge between the fans and the squad. So that's why it was a great moment.
This would be the last great triumph of this French generation. Embarrassing exits would follow in the 2002 World Cup and the 2004 Euros, and this group of players would have their last great moment in the final of the 2006 World Cup, where they lost on penalties to Italy. But the achievements of this French team puts them amongst the very, very best international sides ever.
And very proud about this. Of course, I used to play for the great team like Arsenal. It's the same, but at the end, when you play for your country, yeah, it's an amazing moment.
Former France and Arsenal midfielder Robert Pires, ending that edition of Sporting Witness from me, Steve Hankey. It was a Whistledown production for the BBC World Service.
You're listening to the BBC World Service, where Razia Iqbal discusses the future of public healthcare.
I'll be joined by Dr. Paul Farmer, the renowned physician, anthropologist and writer, to answer questions from people about healthcare where they live or work. We'll be discussing the pandemic, of course, but also the rise in mental health problems, how to tackle malaria, TB, and how we care for our elderly.
A Right to Health at bbcworldservice.com/documentaries. And in an hour, Outlook with Andrea Kennedy.
Amra Sabic El Reyes was just 16 when war took hold of her hometown, Bihać, in Bosnia-Herzegovina. The city was bombed and blockaded for 3 years, but Amra had a lucky charm. A refugee cat who she credits with saving her life.
The newsroom is next on the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
At 10 hours GMT. As China's Communist Party marks its 100-year anniversary, President Xi issues this warning.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress or enslave us. Anyone who dares to try to do that will have their heads bashed bloodied against a great wall of steel.
Indonesia imposes coronavirus restrictions as cases surge. Donald Trump's company is reported to have been indicted in a tax investigation. And Britney Spears' battle for control over her life suffers a big setback. Plus,
this is Free Speech. Free Speech is a program that I have created in order to help the nonverbal.
Do you want to wear your earrings? Yes.
Okay.
A teenager creates an app to help his sister communicate. That's all coming up on the newsroom with me, Janat Jalil, after this update.
Hello, I'm Debbie Russ with the BBC News. In a defiant speech to mark the 100th anniversary of the Communist Party, President Xi Jinping has warned that any foreign power which tried to bully China would have its head bashed bloody. Addressing a carefully vetted audience in Tiananmen Square, Mr. Xi said that China's economic and military renaissance had become irreversible and Beijing would not allow sanctimonious preaching. He repeated his opposition to Taiwanese independence.
Resolving the Taiwan question and realizing China's complete reunification is a historic mission and an unshakable commitment of the CPC. It is also a shared aspiration of all the sons and daughters of the Chinese nation.
China, under Mr. Xi, has become more assertive, but has faced mounting criticism over its human rights record. But Mr. Xi said the party had transformed the future of the Chinese people and altered the landscape of world development. Indonesia says it will impose coronavirus restrictions from Saturday in an attempt to curtail a rapid spike in infections in the Southeast Asian country worst affected by the pandemic. Travel will be restricted, restaurant dining will be banned, and many businesses, schools and public facilities will be closed on the islands of Java and Bali. The Indonesian president, Joko Widodo, has until now been reluctant to impose measures that could harm the economy, but he said the spread of the Delta variant had changed things.
As we all know, the COVID-19 pandemic in the past days has developed very quickly due to new variants. This situation has forced us to take stricter steps, so together we can curb the spread of COVID-19.
The World Health Organization has warned there'll be another wave of coronavirus infections across Europe unless rigorous precautions are taken. The number of COVID cases on the continent has risen again after 10 consecutive weeks of decline. The increase is blamed on the spread of the more infectious Delta variant. Turkey has officially withdrawn from the Istanbul Convention, an international treaty that aims to prevent violence against women. Women's rights groups are expected to hold further demonstrations against the decision. The move has been condemned by the United States and the European Union. Here's Danny Eberhardt.
Women's groups in Turkey say they're not giving up the fight, even after an appeal court rejected an attempt to block the withdrawal. They warn of rising violence against women linked to economic fallout from the coronavirus pandemic. This can be psychological, but also physical. Turkish women continue to be killed by their partners or former partners at alarming rates. For President Erdogan's party, which has its roots in Islamism, the Istanbul Convention undermines family structures.
You're listening to the World News from the BBC. President Putin has signed a law that will oblige foreign internet giants to open local headquarters within Russia. The move is designed to ensure companies like Google, Facebook, Twitter, Telegram and TikTok can be held accountable for any potential breach of Russian law. It will apply to any company that's used by at least 500,000 people a day in Russia. Other companies that are expected to fall within the scope of the law are Amazon, IKEA and Wikipedia. The law specifies a range of sanctions up to and including blocking offending sites. The Japanese carmaker Nissan has announced that it will build a new electric vehicle and a battery plant in Britain. Here's Dominic O'Connell.
The future of the Sunderland plant was questioned in the run-up to the Brexit referendum, with Nissan making it clear it would rather Britain stayed put. That uncertainty is now firmly in the past. Nissan's partner, Envision, will build a large new plant to make batteries for electric cars. Nissan will make a new car at the plant, and there'll be more investment in renewable power for the whole complex. It's not clear how much of the cost is being borne by the government, but Nissan's chief operating officer, Ashwani Gupta, said the scheme would not have been possible without state support.
Pope Francis is holding a day of prayer for Lebanon at the Vatican as the country continues to suffer its worst economic collapse in decades. As the situation in Lebanon worsens, UNICEF has warned that children are increasingly being put at risk as their families are caught in a spiral of poverty. A US judge has rejected a request by Britney Spears to remove her father from his position as her conservator. The singer said the arrangement had led to her having no control over her life and finances for 13 years. She was placed under his guardianship after suffering a series of mental breakdowns. The 39-year-old has said previously that she was traumatised by the arrangement. That's the latest BBC News.
Hello and welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Janat Jalil. China's Communist Party has marked its 100th anniversary with a series of spectacular events and a speech from Xi Jinping. Addressing massed ranks in Tiananmen Square, President Xi said the party had transformed the future of the Chinese people and altered the landscape of world development. But he also had this warning.
The Chinese people will never allow any foreign forces to bully, oppress or enslave us. Anyone who dares to try to do that will have their heads bashed bloodied against a great wall of steel forged by over 1.4 billion people.
Well, this all comes as China is facing increasing global criticism, counteracted at home, as our China correspondent John Sudworth now reports, by a heavy dose of propaganda.
There are quiz shows all about Communist Party history. And exhibitions with massive queues outside marking the key moments, or some of them at least. China's shift in the 1980s to a market economy is celebrated.
The insurance company.
So too is the modern-day space race. But there's no mention of Chairman Mao's Great Leap Forward or the Cultural Revolution, the periodic bouts of chaos and violence that have punctuated one-party rule and caused the deaths of millions. And the main event, a speech by Party General Secretary Xi Jinping in Tiananmen Square, made no reference, of course, to how the party clung to power in 1989 by shooting dead hundreds of unarmed protesters around the very same spot. Such omissions are nowadays simply shrugged off by the public.
China has so many people. There's no need to tell them. They can just learn it by themselves. These achievements are a real success, and we cherish how much China has changed.
Every country will experience such things during its development. But it's a tiny ripple in the long river of history. We tend to look at the positive side, not think of these terrible things.
But today, of course, there are concerns that terrible things are once again happening in the party's name. The extrajudicial internment of hundreds of thousands of minorities in Xinjiang. The mass arrests in Hong Kong following the pro-democracy protests, and the tightening control over thoughts and speech.
So nice to meet you.
Tsai Shah is a former professor from Beijing's elite Central Party school that trains top officials in ideology. Her growing doubts about the party led to her expulsion last year while on sabbatical in the US, and she's now unable to return to China out of fear for her own safety.
In China, 100 years old also means a person has lived long and it is time to think of death. I hope that on this anniversary, the party reviews the serious mistakes of its policy making, which have made the Chinese people suffer and pay such a huge price. It should do redemption, not celebration.
The West's unquestioning trade and engagement with China, she believes, has been a mistake, helping to maintain the Communist Party's hold on power and giving the democratic world what it was trying to avoid, a new Cold War.
After China opened up to the world, it hoped to use the global system to strengthen its own power. That was the real intention.
Today, the party is everywhere. Here, patriotic songs are being piped to the tourists on the Great Wall. As China grows richer and more integrated into the global economy, the party is becoming more, not less powerful. China is busy exploding the idea of a universal set of Western values. On an anniversary marked with pomp, pageantry and pyrotechnics, the world's second largest capitalist economy is celebrating the unreformed Leninist system upon which it's still based.
That report by John Sudworth. Indonesia is being hard hit by the pandemic. President Joko Widodo has so far resisted calls from health experts for a full lockdown. But with COVID cases now surging, new restrictions are coming into force from Saturday. I got more details from Lisa Tambunan in Jakarta.
Indonesia has had the worst COVID outbreak in Southeast Asia. The country has recorded, in total, over 2.1 million positive cases and around 57,000 deaths so far. In recent days, there's been over 20,000 new cases daily. This surge has been linked to the highly infectious Delta variant, and this has put pressure on Indonesian hospitals, with many of the hospitals having almost at full capacity.
So, given that the hospitals are almost at full capacity, the government is now bringing in these new restrictions. What will they consist of?
The restrictions aim to halve the daily infection rate. So currently the country is recording over 20,000 new cases per day. And the measures will be applied on the island of Java, which is the most populated island and where the capital city is located, as well as Bali, which is a popular tourism destination. So under the new rules, all non-essential businesses will have to operate a working from home policy, and there will be distance learning for all schools, malls and places of worship, such as mosques and churches, as well as public leisure activities like parks will be shut down. So these are some of the most strict restrictions that have been implemented in recent days. And we haven't seen restrictions like this since last year when the pandemic hit in the early days.
So this is going to have quite an impact on the economy, an economy that is very dependent on tourism.
Yes, and especially for Bali, which really depends on tourism. Bali's already struggling with the pandemic. And according to the government, the hotel occupancy rate from earlier this year dropped to around 10%. And the island's main resource is tourism, especially from international visitors. So the pandemic has really hit Bali's economy hard. This new lockdown is expected to make an already challenging situation even harder.
Lisa Tambunan. You're listening to the BBC World Service. Still to come on the newsroom, the QR code aimed at making travel in Europe easier. First, Debbie has the headlines.
President Xi Jinping has praised the achievements of the Chinese Communist Party on the 100th anniversary of its founding, and he's warned foreign powers that all attempts to bully China will result in a bloody head. As we've just been hearing, Indonesia is imposing coronavirus restrictions as it fights a sharp rise in infections. And Turkey has formally left an international treaty that aims to combat violence against women, a move widely condemned within the country and abroad.
A grand jury in the United States is reported to have indicted Donald Trump's family business and one of its top executives in connection with a tax investigation. The charges against the Trump Organization and its chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg, are expected to be revealed later today. Prosecutors are hoping that Mr. Weisselberg will cooperate and implicate his boss. My colleague, Justin Webb, has been speaking to our North America editor, John Sopel.
It is very hard to distinguish between the Trump Organization and Donald Trump. Every building bears his name. The two are inseparable. And so going after criminal proceedings against the Trump Organization, of course, reflects on the principal, the former president, Donald Trump. Now, on the face of it, it seems like the charges that are going to be unsealed today in court documents are possibly quite minor. You know, did some executives receive perks that were off the books and that should have been declared? If that's all you've got after a 3-year investigation, people are going to say, hang on, that's not very much. What's all this all about? But I know from legal contacts that they're looking at much bigger questions. Did they artificially inflate the value of buildings through insurance to raise millions of dollars in loans that they shouldn't have been entitled to? And so there are much bigger issues. This isn't the end of a legal process. This is the start of one.
And the big question, does this guy choose, if it right, if he is successfully prosecuted, to go to jail to take the hit, or does he talk?
Well, that is always the question, and that is the way American justice works, where you're always going for the slightly smaller fish to get the bigger fish. And Alan Weisselberg has for nearly half a century been at Donald Trump's side. He knows everything. And if they could get Alan Weisselberg, the chief finance officer of the Trump organization, to spill the beans, then that's a very uncomfortable moment for Donald Trump. For the time being, it looks that Mr. Weisselberg is prepared to take the hit. But this is criminal proceedings. This is a grand jury deciding there are criminal charges to be answered, and that is going to unfold in a court in New York later today.
And we should say Donald Trump, throughout this process, and it's been talked about, as you say, for a long time, has just said there's nothing to see, and presumably still is.
But I think that you're going to see from the Trump supporters, people saying, what's all the fuss about? Why are you doing this? This is just further evidence of the persecution, the witch hunt against him. But for all that, as I say, I don't think this is the end of it. I think this is a start of it, and it could get very, very bumpy indeed for the former president.
John Sopel. A European Union COVID certificate aimed at making travel easier in the EU has come into force. The digital document has a QR code to show that the bearer is vaccinated or has recovered or has had a recent negative test. It's hoped it will eventually be extended to countries outside the EU. Peter Kleeman is a spokesman for Vienna Airport.
Well, we appreciate to have the green pass at least within Europe, which makes traveling much easier between European countries, especially in holiday season. And we would appreciate if we would have such a system also for third-party countries outside of non-Schengen, especially when it comes to long-haul destinations.
Our correspondent in Vienna, Bethany Bell, told me more about how the certificate will work.
Up to now, when you've been travelling, you've had to show a variety of different test or vaccination certificates, often in a whole bunch of different languages, which when you arrive at your country of destination can't necessarily be understood. So the EU is trying to streamline that, and it's developed a digital document with a QR code, which you can either print out or download on your phone. And the QR code will tell you if you've recovered or whether you've been tested or vaccinated for COVID-19. And people can just scan that code and know whether it's a valid certificate.
But there are concerns that the Delta variant of the coronavirus could restrict its use.
The problem is that, this was meant to sort of try and do away with quarantines and further testing when you travel, certainly in the EU itself. But because there is concern about the Delta variant, each individual European country has the right to impose its own rules about granting entry to travellers, although it does have to inform all of the other EU countries what it's doing. And then, of course, the big question is what happens for people coming from other countries outside the EU. And the EU says it's hoping that this can be a sort of a basis for trying to align COVID-19 documents. And they're working with some other countries. I know that at the moment they're working with Britain, for example, but we don't really have a timeline yet as to when that can come into force.
And India, for example, has expressed concerns about the vaccine that it uses not being recognised by this new system.
Well, at the moment, this is for the vaccines which have been recognised within the EU, and that is what the system is set up to deal with. Such matters will have to be will be the matter for negotiation between the EU and other countries as time goes by.
Bethany Bell. Britney Spears' battle for control over her life has suffered a setback. A judge in Los Angeles has denied the pop star's request to have her father removed as a conservator. The case has gained international headlines thanks in part to a documentary titled Framing Britney Spears, and her fans have started using the hashtag #FreeBritBritney on social media. Well, the newsroom's Peter Goffin has been following the story and joins me now in the studio. So, Peter, what is a conservatorship and how did it become part of Britney Spears' life?
Well, a conservatorship is a court order that gives control over parts of a person's life to someone who's deemed more responsible or capable of making decisions. You often see it with elderly people who, for example, have dementia, when power over their care is given to a relative. But in the case of Britney Spears, who was arguably the biggest pop star of the late 90s, her father, Jamie Spears, was given conservatorship over her business and personal affairs in 2008 after she had some mental health issues that were widely covered in the press. Now, you might remember the famous story about her shaving her head at a tattoo parlor, but she'd also been divorced and lost custody of her 2 children. She refused to hand over her sons, which led to a confrontation with police, and at least twice she was admitted to hospital, allegedly for her own safety. Now, Spears has continued to work for years and put out albums and performing live, and court documents say her net worth was $59 million in 2018, but she hasn't had control over her money or much of her personal life for the last 13 years, and she alleges that her father's hold over her has been abusive.
And she's clearly going to be very disappointed about this decision, because we heard a few days ago from her, and she gave some very explosive testimony against her father.
That's right. Now, Spears alleged that under the conservatorship, she's been forced to work against her will and put on psychiatric drugs she did not want. She says she hasn't been allowed to marry her boyfriend, and that although she wants more children, she's not allowed to have a contraceptive device removed. Now, her father gave up conservatorship of the personal side of his daughter's life in 2019 after an illness that he was suffering, but that now lies with a woman who works as Spears' caregiver, but Jamie Spears still has say over his daughter's money. This year, a judge allowed a private wealth management firm to be co-conservator of the financial matters, but Britney Spears wanted her father removed from that entirely. That's the request that's been turned down by the courts, but Spears' case is not over yet. She can still petition to have the conservatorships terminated completely, and she's due back in court in 2 weeks' time.
I'm sure it'll be dominating the headlines in the weeks to come. Peter, thank you. Peter Goffin there. Here in London, Prince William and Prince Harry will unveil a statue today of their mother, Princess Diana, on what would have been her 60th birthday. Her sons commissioned the statue to reflect on her life and legacy. It will stand in one of her favourite places, a garden at Kensington Palace. Here's our royal correspondent, Daniela Relf.
Prince William and Prince Harry will unveil the statue in a scaled-back event this afternoon, alongside their mother's siblings and members of the statue committee. The Diana, Princess of Wales statue will stand in the sunken garden. The garden layout has been redesigned and replanted to create a calmer and more reflective setting for the statue. The unveiling will be the first time William and Harry have been seen together since the Duke of Edinburgh's funeral. Their own relationship remains strained. It's hoped the unveiling of the statue, under the gaze of their mother, will help ease the tension between them.
Daniela Relf. Now, Debbie has some other stories from our news desk.
A record-breaking heatwave in Western Canada has now been blamed for hundreds of deaths. The province of British Columbia has recorded more than 485 deaths over the past 5 days, nearly triple the number expected over that period. The town of Lytton, which broke a Canadian temperature record at 49.6 degrees Celsius, has been evacuated because of wildfires. Zeke Housefather, a climate scientist in Canada, says this is almost certainly a consequence of global warming.
We're not going to have 121 degrees weather in Canada, every year, but this sort of thing will become much more likely. We can say that with some certainty. And if we continue putting emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, it'll become a much more likely normal than it even is today.
Thailand's Prime Minister has admitted that the reopening of the popular resort island of Phuket to foreign tourists carries a risk, but he's insisted it's one Thai people have to accept in order to make a living. Prayut Chan-o-cha made the remarks as the first holidaymakers vaccinated against COVID-19 began to arrive on the island. Lionel Messi's contract with Barcelona Football Club has run out, and the Argentine superstar is now officially a free agent. Talks over a new contract with the Spanish club are believed to be ongoing, meaning Messi may well decide to stay at the Nou Camp. But for now, he's available for absolutely nothing.
That's quite a bargain, isn't it, Debbie? Thanks very much for that. An American teenager has created an app to help his younger sister communicate. Della Calder from Texas struggles to speak. Her brother, Archer, has developed a free, easy-to-use piece of software that allows people to sound out words using pictures on a screen. Our reporter, Harry Bly, has been in touch with Archer and his mum, Caitlin.
Hey, Della, do you want to be on TV?
You
Tell me.
Say yes.
Yes.
You want to be on TV? What?
Della Calder is 14 and has a rare genetic condition which affects her ability to speak. For years, her parents have spent thousands of dollars on treatment and have travelled across the United States to access specialist care. In 2016, she was formally diagnosed with a condition called Bainbridge-Roper syndrome. Last January, Della's older brother Archer decided he wanted to help his sister to communicate better. The 17-year-old felt it unjust that families in America, including his, had spent so much money on specialist apps on top of the medical costs they'd already had to pay. AAC apps, that's augmentative and assistive communication apps, can cost up to $500. And while these are bespoke pieces of software made by specialist companies, for some families that's simply unaffordable.
I was like, geez, like this is crazy. That's a gateway to do something that every human can do. Like that'd be like if my glasses cost like $500 for like the cheapest kind. You know what I mean? That would be absolutely absurd.
So he began to develop his own app, and after a week of coding, he shared the first version of Free Speech on his TikTok account.
This is Free Speech. Free Speech is a program that I have created in order to help the nonverbal.
There was an outpouring of support from people, including other developers, who came forward to donate their time and skills to help Archer with his project, which he published on the open source platform GitHub.
That was amazing, because at the time I was like 16, I was trying to do something that whole companies and teams of developers are paid very large salaries to do.
So here's the app. I'm using it on my iPhone. You just type the address app.freespeech.aac.com, and on the screen there are tiles with pictures, a bit like emojis on. And when I press them, you hear a word.
There.
Della finds it hard to communicate with just the app. She's made up hand signals. At the moment, she's learning to give simple answers using Free Speech.
Do you want to wear your earrings?
Yes.
Okay.
Here you go.
I think she's made me more understanding of how it can help her, and every day is a little bit more progress. But yeah, for the most part, communication is all through signs that she's made up. You told me yes.
Yes.
Yeah? You want to wear them on the school bus?
Going forward, Archer hopes to develop the app further and keep it free and accessible to all.
I'm just working along her pace, I'm just trying to spend every last minute that she's here with me and with my family, just wanting to see her do better and be happier.
And he has the full support of his parents.
He's the one who put it on TikTok. He's the one who found developers, and it's just been amazing to watch him do this thing that I think helps him feel like he's connecting with his sister, when it's kind of hard to do with someone who doesn't talk.
Lovely story there. That report was by Harry Bly, and you can learn more about Free Speech and see the app in action on the BBC News website. And on that website, you can also download our hugely popular Global News podcast, which is put together by the same team that makes this programme. I'll be back at 12 hours GMT with the next edition of the Newsroom. Thanks very much for listening.
This is the BBC World Service with a new series looking at tiny symbols which inspire surprisingly big emotions.
Emoji. Billions of these cute little characters are sent every day. Insert smiling face with hearts.
My most used emoji is the girl who's shrugging her shoulders. I feel like I use that one a lot.
I'm Vivienne Nunes.
And I'm Sarah Treenor. Join us as we find out who makes them and who controls them. Adding curious face emoji.
The main reason I invented emoji in 1998 is that I believed it could support messages to express your feelings in the right way.
We'll be delving into their history
and their dark side.
When it comes to communication, criminals are ahead of us, almost always.
In part 1, what do you do when the one emoji you want isn't there?
2 smiley faces. Sunday at 9 GMT.
On the BBC World Service in just a few minutes.
You can be in some pretty tough conditions, and the last thing you want to do is get a food packet out and boil some water and then pour it in.
When you're in a race that lasts months and you have to take all your food with you, what do you bring and how do you cook it? I'm Tamsin Ford, and on the food chain this week, the diet of an endurance athlete. That's all after the news.
BBC News with Debbie Russ. China's President Xi Jinping has claimed that the Chinese people have created a new world and warned that foreign powers will get their heads bashed if they try to bully the country. His defiant rhetoric came at a huge ceremony for the centenary of the ruling Communist Party. Mr. Xi repeated pledges that have alarmed China's neighbours, including a promise to unify Taiwan with the mainland. Indonesia is imposing coronavirus restrictions from Saturday in an attempt to curtail a rapid spike in infections. It's the worst affected country in Southeast Asia, and cases of the Delta variant are putting hospitals under growing pressure. The Prime Minister of Thailand, Prayut Chan-o-cha, says the reopening of the holiday island of Phuket to foreigners is a risk, but one that his compatriots must accept so they can earn a living. Foreign tourists can now spend 14 days on Phuket without quarantining. The streets of the Bangladeshi capital Dhaka are almost empty as the country starts a strict week-long lockdown, coinciding with a record increase in COVID cases. The World Health Organization has warned there'll be another wave of the pandemic across Europe unless rigorous precautions are taken. The number of infections on the continent has risen again after 10 consecutive weeks of decline. The German Interior Minister Horst Seehofer has again questioned the decision to